In Ernest Hemingway's novels "The Sun Also Rises", "Farewell to Arms", and "For Whom the Bell Tolls", universal themes of the human condition are explored through Hemingway's writing style, capturing the literary importance of the novels and providing significance to the American landscape. Okay, so in order to establish what Hemingway's writing style really does for his novels, it's important to establish what brevity does for his writing style and for his novels. So, for the sake of comparison, here's a passage that I wrote, "The Dog Sat Down," and here's a passage that Hemingway wrote in "The Sun Also Rises." We started up the road and then went across a meadow and found a path that crossed the fields and went toward the woods on the slope of the first hill. The fields were rolling and grassy, and the grass was short from the sheep grazing. Note that brevity does not necessarily take away from the depth of ideas. Hemingway is still able to utilize imagery and portray complex scenes. Okay, so in "The Sun Also Rises", Jake Barnes is the protagonist and the narrator. He fought in World War I and was rendered impotent by an injury. He's madly in love with Lady Brett Ashley, but his impotence renders his pursuits futile. Lady Brett Ashley is Jake's love, and she reciprocates Jake's feelings towards her. She loves Jake too. And throwback to last unit in A-Push, where we learned about flappers. Brett is a flapper. It's mentioned that she has that short hair and she's really independent. In fact, promiscuity and independence are her main characteristics. She worked in a hospital during World War I and met her first love, subsequently her first husband there, but he died of dysentery during the war. Nearly all male characters fall in love with Brett. Okay, Robert Cohen is actually one of the most interesting characters in the novel. He's a direct contrast to Jake Barnes, a foil character, and he's got all of the morality and the direction that Jake is lacking. Well, really, many characters in the novel are lacking. And he has all of this because he didn't fight and wasn't really affected by World War I. And the key conflict is what should be valued in the wake of tragedy, really stemming from that lost generation, lack of morality, and loss of direction. Okay, so here's a passage that it's really a great example of what Hemingway's writing style does for the themes of "The Sun Also Rises". He was fairly happy, except that like many people living in Europe, he would rather have been in America, and he had discovered writing. He wrote a novel, and it was not really such a bad novel as the critics later called it, although it was a very poor novel. Okay, in this passage, it's kind of part of the initial roasting of Robert Cohen that's really the introduction of the novel. It's kind of like an iceberg, and many of Hemingway's passages are actually like this. In fact, it's the best way to really analyze the passages in "The Sun Also Rises" as like an iceberg where simplicity begets complexity beneath the surface. No, like the reader can infer from the passage that Jake is insecure. I mean, a secure person certainly wouldn't start out a novel about someone other than an autobiographical novel in which they're the narrator start out the novel talking about someone other than themselves and just really roasting them. And And they can also infer that Jake really dislikes Robert Cohn. So, really, this is from Hemingway's banquet speech, and note that it's almost like a prophecy of sorts. Things may not be immediately discernible in what a man writes, and in this sometimes he is fortunate. But eventually they are quite clear, and by these and the degree of alchemy that he possesses, he will endure or be forgotten. And as Aldrich would write nearly 60 years later, since 1961, the sheer volume of critical and biographical information about Hemingway has reached the proportions of a corporate industry, with branches and subsidiaries spreading across the world into virtually every civilized country where his work has been translated and published. As he stated, as Aldrich states, it's really almost like a prophecy, the plurality of the lenses that analysts have used to analyze Hemingway's novels, especially The Sun Also Rises, is really quite impressive.
For Whom the Bell Tolls is another novel by Ernest Hemingway. Set in the midst of the Spanish Civil War, it highlights these themes. The grim reality of war. The flashbacks and the fighting prove that no war is pretty, especially not the Spanish Civil War. The guerrillas' extermination of the fascists in a village proves that they are not only similar, but virtually no different from the fascist forces they claim to be better than. Another theme that For Whom the Bell Tolls highlights is hope in futile situations. As their mission drags on and on, both Pablo and Jordan realize that their mission is futile, and they will most likely lose. Jordan decides to keep planning for success through his newfound hope that takes the form of his and Maria's relationship. Despite his reservations about his ability to both fight and love Maria, he pushes on towards success so he can have both. A third theme found in For Whom the Bell Tolls is duty. A constant question brought around in the book is it better to shoot your wounded and your critically wounded ally who cannot go on to prevent his capture, or should they keep on fighting until they die? This question is repeated many times throughout the book, through Jordan's experiences with Kharkov, to the fascist village in the flashback. In the end, Jordan realizes that being shot by his compatriots does nothing for them, and decides to go down fighting. Some characters in For Whom the Bell Tolls are Robert Jordan. Robert Jordan is an American college professor who joins the Spanish Civil War on the side of the Republicans in a guerrilla unit deep within fascist territory. He is in charge of demolitions and explosives and is charged with blowing up a bridge. Jordan is passionate about the values of Republican Spain, the past values, but has grown disillusioned with the Republican cause as it is drawn towards communism. Maria is a 19-year-old survivor of the fascist occupation of her village. She falls in love with Jordan. Maria stands strong and beautiful despite witnessing her parents executed in front of her and being raped by fascists. Pablo is our third character. He is a war-weary old man, the leader of the guerrilla troop that Jordan joins up with. He is stubborn and a drunk. He used to be a great fighter, but has grown tired of fighting and sabotages the Republicans' efforts a couple times. In For Whom the Bell Tolls, the fascist airplanes represent foreboding and negative events. It was 3 o'clock. Then he heard the far-off, distant throbbing, and looking up, he saw the planes. Hemingway, 376. After making a tough tactical decision, whether or not to go and save a fellow band of guerrillas, Jordan is wondering how the fight will play out. As he finishes wondering, he hears the planes come and realizes the other band has been lost. These planes come multiple times throughout For Whom the Bell Tolls, and every time they represent a Republican loss and the ever-growing futility of the Republican cause as the fascists gain more and more power. Overall, For Whom the Bell Tolls highlights these themes very well through the grim reality of war, its hope in futile situations, and its emphasis on duty. For
my outside reading book, I chose A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. The young journalist from Illinois was flung headlong into the First World War when he volunteered to serve as an ambulance driver in Italy, where he received his baptism of fire at the Piave front and was severely wounded by shell splinters. The 19-year-old's first violent experience of war is an essential factor in Hemingway's biography. Not that he was daunted by it. On the contrary, he found that it was a priceless asset for a writer to see war at first hand and to be able to depict it truthfully. This is an excerpt from the Nobel Prize in Literature 1954 presentation speech, which relates directly to the novel that I chose. Ernest Hemingway's novel, A Farewell to Arms, follows the World War I life of an American ambulance driver, Lieutenant Frederick Henry. He is fighting on the Italian front. Hemingway served in the Red Cross during World War I as an ambulance driver, and although it is not specifically said, the development of Henry as a character has many autobiographical influences from Hemingway himself. Henry experiences the grim reality of war, which is also the main theme of the novel. Throughout the novel, the majority of the characters resent the war due to the terrible destruction it causes. Within the first couple chapters of the novel, Henry establishes himself as a conflicted soldier. He neither has a thirst for glory or a strong belief in the cause of the war, which adds to his detachment throughout the novel. When driving back home from his post, Henry picks up a soldier with hernia. "What's the matter?" He looked at me, then stood up. "I'm going on." "What's the trouble?" "The war." "What's wrong with your leg?" "It's not my leg, I got a rupture." "Why don't you ride with the transport?" I asked. "Why don't you go to the hospital?" "They won't let me." The lieutenant said I slipped the truss on purpose. The soldier admits to throwing away his truss, which is a support for the hernia, with the purpose of not having to return it to the front. Here, one of the first signs of Henry's detachment from the war is shown when he ends up helping out the soldier by instructing him to bump his head so that he can be accepted into the hospital. Henry does not condemn the actions of the soldier for admittedly removing his truss to make his hernia worse, but rather helps him plot his way to the hospital. In Chapter 9, in the midst of combat and falling mortar shells, Henry risks his life to grab some cold pasta and a slab of cheese from the medical station to bring back to his platoon mates on the battlefield. Then there was one that we did not hear coming until the sudden rush. We both went flat, and with the flash and bump of the burst and the smell, heard the signing off of the fragments and the rattle of the falling brick. Gordini got up and ran for the dugout. I was after him, holding the cheese, its smooth surface covered with brick dust. This scene sticks out because it is a weird objective that Henry took while in the middle of intense combat. Although he successfully acquires the pasta and the cheese, the action does not prove to be heroic or noble, which adds to Henry's noticeable detachment from the war and his indifference to whether he lives or dies. Henry actually ends up getting injured in the same battle and is out of service while his leg heals. While recovering, Henry meets Ettore Moretti, who serves as a juxtaposition between the values of himself and Henry. Ettore has been awarded several war medals and claims that he has worked hard for them. Henry calls him a legitimate hero, but also explains that he is a very dull person. While Ettore is ambitious and proud of his medals and the glory that he has been awarded, Henry is detached from the possible glory that the war may bring, and he is more focused on finishing his service. Jumping to the last few chapters of the book, we see the progression of the war and the effects it has on Henry and the rest of the army. At this stage of the war, the Italian army has called for a retreat. They went a little faster. I opened up my holster, took the pistol, aimed at the one who had talked the most, and fired. I missed and they both started to run. I shot 3 times and dropped one. The other went through the hedge and was out of sight. I fired at him through the hedge as he ran across the field. The pistol clicked empty and I put in another clip. In this scene, Henry shoots at 2 officers for refusing to help clear the mud so their car can pass. The effects of the war have altered Henry's moral judgment, causing him to shoot the innocent officers just because they refused an order. After the incident, there appears to be no disapproval from the other soldiers, showing the grim reality of war and how it has left the soldiers to set their own boundaries. The act of killing the officers came out of nowhere, showing the confusion and meaninglessness of the war. The reader is met with a puzzling situation, as Henry has not displayed acts of aggression in the beginning of the book, but now has this abnormal reaction to 2 officers, ignoring his orders. Overall, Henry serves as the symbol of the grim reality of war. In the beginning, Henry showed his indifference to the war, but due to the inevitable outcome of the war, Henry commits this act of aggression in the final chapters of the book, where he kills an innocent officer for ignoring an order. Hemingway suggests through this change of morality that war is nothing more than a dark and dangerous path, which cannot be endured without change.